You are about to listen to a new episode of the Redefining CyberSecurity podcast with Sean Martin. Have you ever thought we're selling cybersecurity insincerely, buying it indiscriminately, and deploying it ineffectively? Well, perhaps we are. Let's look at how we can organize a successful information security program that integrates business culture with people, process, and technology to drive growth and protect business value.
And hello, everybody. You're very welcome to a new episode of Redefining Cybersecurity. This is Sean Martin, your host, where I get to talk about all kinds of cool things related to technology and cybersecurity, and some cool folks I get to connect with as well to have these conversations. Walter, good to see you.
Sean, thanks for having me on.
Glad to have you on. And we met, I believe, it was at High Trust Collaborate over a year
Almost
ago.
exactly a year ago.
Yeah, right around there. And I remember having some good conversations with you then, and we've stayed in touch. And as with many of my episodes, are usually triggered or inspired by something that somebody smart like you posts, and that's the case here. And we're looking at kind of this world of automation and orchestration and low/no code and tools to do a bunch of things for the business, automate a bunch of processes, connect people, connect data, connect processes, and of course we'll just sprinkle AI on all of that as well, just for some fun, right? And that's kind of where we're going to go today. Kind of how does AI fit into all this stuff? Our team organizations using tools and connecting AI, and what some of the outcomes might look like, but also what some of the pitfalls might be if they're not thinking about this stuff clearly, which you do all day, all night, I'm pretty sure, Walter.
It's my job.
That's your job. So on that note, maybe a few words from you about some of the things you worked on in the past, what you're up to now, and maybe the inspiration behind that post to kind of kick things into gear.
Yeah, so I'm the founder of StackAware, and we help AI-powered companies measure and manage cybersecurity, compliance, and privacy risk. And I have the pleasure of working with a lot of organizations at the cutting edge when it comes to AI development and deployment. And a trend that I'm seeing that's quite common and something that I'm participating in is the use of no-code tools plus non-deterministic artificial intelligence systems. And it provides a very powerful way to accelerate productivity, but at the same time can bring with it a whole series of risks.
Yeah, no question about that. And I'm certain my audience has been beaten over the head a gazillion times at this point of there's risk in AI. Pay attention to what you're doing. We're going to get a little deeper into a couple areas. Now, you mentioned a few tools here. I'm not necessarily looking to mention brands, but Zapier is one that I happen to use, one of the two you mentioned in this post. And I'll include the link to the post for folks as well. And I'll just kind of put it out there what I do, some of the things I do with this tool. It's primarily connecting with our guests on shows and connecting with our audience on social media and kind of automating the ingestion of certain types of data and the creation of certain processes and the outputs of data that we can use across our portfolio. And I don't know that we're using we're not putting a lot of IP in here, but it does make me wonder, what am I training the certain models on when I use this? Are there things that I'm exposing my organization to as I pump data through this system? And is it worth it? So I'm going to, hopefully I'm painting a picture of how I use it to some degree, but I'm curious, what are some common areas where you see organizations using tools to gain efficiencies, to reduce human error? I don't know, what are some of the things they're doing?
Yeah, I've seen companies do everything from automate the menial stuff that you alluded to, like processing information, taking forms, moving data from one place to another, all the way up to being the core of their business. And, that's how they process sensitive information. Obviously, there's some restrictions on what you can do with some of the no code tools out there in terms of business associate agreements and data residency and things like that. But there's not necessarily a reason why you couldn't use a no code tool as the backbone for your business operations. The key is just understanding the security, compliance, privacy implications of doing that.
And do organizations think along those lines at this point in time? I'm just thinking, what types of data are they putting in there? And you mentioned being bound to certain laws and regulations that might, and agreements, BAA agreements, certainly in the healthcare space, where you may not be allowed to put data in certain places, specifically in AI, because it extends that data access beyond your own world, which maybe the BAA agreement says otherwise.
Yeah, I mean, really understanding the organizational context is key to making informed decisions about any information system, but specifically when it comes to no code. So, if you're a very early stage startup and you are building an AI powered meme generator, then your requirements for data confidentiality might be almost zero. Your requirements for integrity also might not be that high because sometimes you might get something funny that comes out there. Availability might be a concern for you if your platform requires people to be able to access it during certain times. So that's kind of at one end of the spectrum. Conversely, if you're in the healthcare space, then you've got all three. You've got confidentiality, integrity, and availability that you need to protect against, and you need to make sure that the system that you're working with is giving you what you need from that requirements perspective.
And so where do organizations, I think we touched on this a little bit when we met the first time, but where do organizations kind of put that analysis? Is it because it's no code? Does it land in the business world, or is there a program team? We're not talking about engineers here necessarily, but there may be some false understanding that no code still means there's code, just you're not writing it, right? There's still coding going on somewhere, and who knows what's going on behind there. So how does an organization understand their business processes, their data sets, the things they're trying to build with it, and who kind of owns that picture of what's appropriate to do versus not?
Just like with any information system, I think a cross functional business leader is the person who should be ultimately accountable for making risk decisions because that person will usually be owning the profit and loss statement and is ultimately accountable for mission success or failure. But security teams can help enable that process by highlighting risks to the business and the business unit from the use of no code tools, for example, and helping the business leader establish policies and procedures, secure development guides, checklists that can assist individual business users when they're building automations, when they're integrating third-party tools to understand exactly what they're doing to help avoid some of those unacceptable risks.
And let's talk about some of those, because you list a few here that I think if you hire a team of engineers and you set some requirements and they set off to build something, and let's just use the first one, or actually let's use the second one, where a bad prompt triggers a database delete or an override or something. If you have engineers, you might actually, a product team, you might say this is what it's supposed to do, these are the things it shouldn't do, and you have developers building to that, and you have quality assurance testing against that. Usually a formal process to do that. My expectation is that some of that formality of what's what and what's not, and kind of the overview of managing all that, might be a little looser when we're talking about no code tools. How does an organization need to know, or do they know that they should look for bad prompts that delete their database? I mean, and who's going to check for that? And how would they check for that with the no code environment?
Specifically in the case of no code and data integrity, as you're alluding to, having a human in the loop approval step for anything that is modifying, deleting, updating records is going to be something that I would recommend in most cases, unless there's some reason why you don't especially care about the data that you're impacting. So having human review of database delete and update operations, I would say, is a key control.
Another scenario you provided here is chained AI functions, and specifically this an example you gave is it pings customers by mistake. I don't know if this is something you've actually seen, because clearly you might have either one chain of AI prompts that continue to build on each other, or you might have multiple LLMs that you're using data and outputs and cross-checking or redoing or revising content. That, I don't know, presumably you might have some filters or some redaction and taking place in one area, but it might get fed to another, and the redaction gets lost and the privacy gets lost. So an example you gave, a customer gets pinged. Maybe that customer is not supposed to be known, let alone pinged. So what do you see there, and what are some of the things that organizations can do for that scenario?
Specifically in the world of no code, it's possible to build recursive functions that maybe not infinitely, but extensively execute over a period of time, and maybe you accidentally send 50 emails to a customer by running a loop over a function that you didn't intend to. And if you're using a third-party artificial intelligence service like OpenAI or something like that, you may be racking up a bill doing compute intensive processes while you're executing that loop. So it's important for business users who are developing no code systems integrated with AI to understand these risks and to have the right safeguards in place. So understanding that functions can loop over themselves for a long period of time, maybe applying timeouts, rate limits, things like that are all safeguards that organizations can put in place to help manage some of these risks.
I know my own experience with the Zapier tool in particular. Um, I always get upset, but it has a very fail hard model, I think, where if it hits something, it basically is done, which sucks if you actually want it to go through. Um, but I would imagine some teams find a way to work through that to get that complete autonomy. But the whole idea is that it's set it and forget it. What are some things there? And we talk about in terms of granting access and granting rights and giving um, applications control over data and the things it can do with it. That those things tend to creep, right? People get more access, systems have more power once they learn more, especially when we're talking about LLMs and AI models coming into play. So how do organizations kind of get a handle on that scenario?
I think data access is a perennial problem that all organizations need to deal with, and making sure that you have a lightweight process for getting approvals for which data sources you're going to integrate into is important. I know specifically on Zapier, on the enterprise plan, you can allow list or block list certain types of applications, which would give you some of that control there, make sure that anything that's being integrated is meeting your business and security requirements.
And this is kind of the category you have this under is under excessive autonomy. We kind of a bit moved over into the confidentiality, perhaps providing access. You talk here about uh, routing or misrouting, and I touched on a little bit earlier, exposing sensitive records. Or I think the other thing that I recognize maybe maybe not everybody has a view into this world, but it's not just a no-code environment that you're pumping data into some AI models. It's a bunch of applications connected through API keys, and they're instructing each other to do different things, and that can basically connect things that shouldn't connect, perhaps, because you can nest functions, you can nest workflows. Somebody might build something over here that gets reused across the organization. It does something, they make a change there. You don't know that, again, that scope creep of what's possible. How clearly guardrails need to be put in place in terms of, this is what the data is, here's what the access rules are, here's how the usage rules sit. A lot of that can be defined in LLM environments, but how do organizations do that when they start pumping no code? Are there rules or instructions or something that they can set somewhere early on so the whole process kind of checks itself, or what does that look like?
Unfortunately, with a lot of no-code tools, the enterprise security features that you might expect could be a little bit lacking in some cases. So I mentioned Zapier gives you the ability to allow or block certain types of applications, but that's kind of where it ends. And you're going to be relying quite a bit on user discretion to make sure that data is correctly being transferred from one application to another, that you're not violating any residency requirements, any compliance requirements, that you're not sending it to sources where it's being trained on when you have agreed or decided that you don't want it to be trained on. So user education is going to be really key at this stage, because the no code platforms don't quite have the full governance infrastructure in place to manage these types of security requirements and enforce them at a machine level.
And how different is this particular environment from, I'll say, a traditional app development world where presumably you have some visibility and some control. Granted, there's still third-party services and API-driven stuff that takes place there, but at least you can pick and choose some of those things, and again, write code-based guardrails and wrappers and tokens and things like that, where, I don't know, in the world of no code, the idea is to enable people who don't know how to code to do this stuff. So are they going to know what tokens are instead of passing straight data through? So how do we get around some of the world of opening up everybody to improve their own business workflows and use AI to do that, but then also not put the organization at risk?
Business users are going to need to figure out how to implement secure no code systems. And that's because the traditional distinction between a product manager, between a developer, between a QA tester, so on and so forth, is kind of disappearing in the age of AI. You're seeing the person who's coming up with the requirement, maybe the person who's implementing it now. And no code systems accelerate this trend. Now, if that's going to happen in a productive and secure and compliant manner, then the person who is implementing the requirements, who probably understands them best, will also need to understand the basics of security architecture, things like least privilege, like limiting data access to the absolute minimum, to requiring authentication where appropriate. So these basics are things that business users are going to need to understand.
And in your experience thus far, who's driving this awareness and understanding throughout the organization? Typically, security, sadly, has been driven by regulation. So new law comes out, says you can't do this. We then put some security controls in place to make sure we don't do that. Is that the same with this? And do you see it being effective, if it is?
I don't foresee no code specific regulation or legislation coming out, but what I will say is that Organizations can always do a better job of tracking the assets that they are using, and how they define that is up to them. But I would say at a minimum, you need to understand, are business users going into freemium SaaS tools like Zapier has a free plan that you can go into? Do you have a way to detect that if that's happening? Additionally, if you're using an enterprise product like Microsoft 365, understanding what capabilities something like Microsoft Copilot Studio brings with it is also important, because Microsoft's actually been making it quite difficult to disable Copilot Studio at an individual user level. I think they're pushing hard for adoption here, but at the same time, that has some security implications if you have a very innovative but not necessarily educated user whip up a bunch of copilots and start making them available for the organization.
And on that note, I'm assuming that's their goal, is to spin up a bunch of agents that do things for the org. I mean, even one of the tools I'm using, there's create the code, and then there's a publish. And it's very tempting to want to hit the publish button, but that's not what I want to do, because I'm not looking to make that thing public. I just want the code for my own use. How do you kind of mentioned it earlier, the freemium versions of these tools, the capabilities of them might not be easily to detect that they're being used. They're not costing money. They're maybe not hitting the network and slowing it down. So how do organizations kind of do that? I presume culture is part of it, policies that employees adhere to, so say they'll adhere to, but then there's a reality of shadow everything, right?
I think it's incumbent on security teams to come up with lightweight approval processes for low risk use cases, especially involving no code, because it's going to be such a backbone of business productivity. So, at a minimum, having pre approved tools that people can go into and start using right away for certain use cases is a big help. A more advanced level would be something like an automated system for evaluating the risk of a third party tool and comparing that to your organization's risk appetite. And something that we're working on right now is a database of these types of risk assessments that are off the shelf to allow much more rapid adoption of no code tools, while at the same time managing the most critical risks.
So I'm going through the list here. You have a playbook that you mentioned, and it has, I'll just go down the list here: constrain, contract, decide, design, train, prove, test, and strip. So a lot of steps there. What does that look like from a project management perspective? Is that a linear process? Is it a waterfall? Is it a loop? Is there a lot of dependencies in that cycle? Maybe kind of paint a picture for us what that looks like.
So when you're building a no code governance program, there are some upfront steps that you can take. For example, allow listing certain applications that you might only adjust periodically. Also, looking at the contractual obligations or requirements of the tool, that's something that might be a more periodic review. More on a more granular level would be implementing those human approval gates or post hoc human analyses of the performance of the system. That's something that would be more regular. And then something that would be continuous would be having an ability to strip out certain types of data that may not be certified for use in the tool, and a combination of more periodic control enforcement, but also continuous implementation of your security requirements will be the most effective path.
I want to go to the human in the loop, because it's been mentioned a few times, and I'm all for it. But it kind of goes back to the picture I was painting earlier, where there's a system that I've set up. I want it to go from A to Z, unfaltered, straight through, work out all the errors so that it completes on its own, fully autonomous. I get upset when it doesn't, if there's an error. If the whole point of this is to get the human out of the loop, how do the organizations convince themselves to put the human back in? And how does that look? Because if the goal is to take some process from multiple days down to a couple hours, and you throw a human in there, and they're not in the office at the moment, so it's going to take them to the next day, or they're on vacation. You can see, I'll paint a gazillion scenarios here, but humans can slow things back down. So how do orgs convince themselves that the human is appropriate to keep in the loop?
There are three main ways that I would recommend applying human in the loop to artificial intelligence systems. And organizations should look at the risk posed by the use case in deciding which technique to use. So, first of all, there would be a default deny approach where a human needs to affirmatively approve something every time it happens. You should reserve this for the highest risk use cases, anything related to healthcare, financial data, things like that. Next, you could do a human approval within a certain window, but then the system automatically it proceeds if there's no human input. So this would be kind of a more medium risk use case where maybe you're sending marketing emails or things like that, or moving data in a database. And then the use case where you have the lowest risk would be appropriate for kind of a post hoc review where you look at the performance of the AI system after the fact and confirm or deny whether it meets your business and security requirements.
I'm curious, are there scenarios, because you get to see and talk to a lot of people, are there scenarios that teams feel this is a benign process, the data is not very critical, there's not a lot of IP, the privacy is not really an issue, but then you come in and you say, but have you thought about X, Y, and Z? And then the opposite is true, that the risk is higher and beyond their appetite. Are there scenarios that you've seen? I don't know, some that stand out or some that are common across different sectors?
I'd say that unknown unknowns, which is what you're alluding to, are one of the most difficult challenges in cybersecurity, privacy, and compliance. Because if you have done an analysis and you think you've covered everything, but you haven't, then that that's where the most dangerous risks come from. So I would say getting a third party opinion on your architecture, on your obligations, on how you've deployed your no code and AI systems is probably the most effective way to help spot those types of issues before they materialize.
And I'm looking at I think it's your second to last point here. Yeah, treat no code automation as a production system with audits, approvals, and contracts. And it just it sparks this note in my mind that you may not even, we kind of go back to the BAA, business agreements. You might not even be allowed to do some of this stuff. So doing it and then trying to figure out if it's secure enough, you may not have that ability. Are there laws and regulations that just say you can't, and that should really be the initial line in the sand, and for some business processes, or are there ways around you can do it, but only if, I don't know, bring the stuff in on site, on premises, or use a certain model with certain controls in place? Are there hard lines or soft lines that can be maneuvered?
There are both hard lines and soft lines when it comes to no code and compliance. So I'll give an example. The tool N8N, which is a pretty popular automation system, they will not enter into a business associate agreement with customers. They just don't do that. So you can't process PHI on their cloud-based platform. Now, they do offer a customer managed version that you can download and deploy into your own environment. And it's conceivable that you could operate it in a HIPAA compliant manner if you're applying the appropriate controls, you have the right access controls on the environment. So there are some hard lines. For example, don't give PHI to an organization that won't enter into a BAA, but there are some softer lines where you could potentially do a customer managed version or deployment method for a tool and still use it in a HIPAA compliant way.
So that's great, Walter. I appreciate all that. A lot of good insights throughout. I want to, in the last few minutes here, maybe speak directly to the executives that listen to the show and watch the YouTube videos, specifically CISOs, CIOs, chief risk officers. There's a bit of advice, a lesson learned working with that group yourself. Anything you want to share with them to say, you think you might, but you might want to look at this, or a best practice is always ask this question and you'll do very well down the line having that initial piece in mind. I'm just making stuff up here. Anything you want to highlight for that group to say, here's how you can do better with this particular program?
I would advise security leaders to not attempt to ban no-code implementations, because that is going to both slow down the business, but also create the likelihood of greater shadow IT and shadow AI in your environment. The key is having a risk-based approach to these types of systems to make sure that you are managing the biggest risks, while at the same time not being a blocker for development and operations and the business generating value. Because at the end of the day, that's why you exist in your role, is to help preserve that value. So facilitate it in a secure and compliant way, but don't get in the way.
And then from a business leader perspective, the executive leadership team, let's speak to them a little bit. I'm going to go out on a limb and suggest perhaps that when an organization is enabling their employees to do things, I was at a legal conference where there was firms saying, we're opening up this world to our lawyers, and attorneys can go in and vibe code and pull in automation and orchestration and all this stuff. Go for it, have at it. Sounds amazing, a little scary, but in that environment, you're opening it up for that. Have you seen organizations do that in a way? And if so, maybe some advice for business leaders to say, this is the culture we want. We want to empower you. This is what it looks like. We're going to partner with our risk and security teams to ensure that we're safeguarding you. But we want to hear from you. What are you trying to accomplish? What are your initial ideas? Almost like a think tank or a suggestion box, or I don't know, Skunkworks projects, right? Or Skunkworks is known versus Shadow IT is not known. So have you come across any organizations that do that well, create a culture that have the guardrails, and any advice or thoughts on that, speaking to that audience?
My biggest recommendation for business leaders when it comes to no code and AI deployments would be to engage with the security, privacy, and compliance stakeholders in your company early. Make clear that your goal is to deliver business value, but that you are willing to take heed of their recommendations, their concerns, and that all things being equal, you'd rather do it in the most secure way possible, while at the same time, making clear that you have requirements that you need to deliver on, and, really only ethical or legal lines will be the things that will stop you. So I would say bringing in the appropriate risk advisors early on is going to be key to successful rollout of a no code and AI program.
And just final thought here, is there anything that either of those groups should pass down as if there's one thing to consider as you're building your no code thing, ask this one question, what would that question be?
Why am I doing this? That would be an important question to ask
There you
first,
go.
because I've seen throughout my entire career, I've seen lots of organizations embark on these big projects that it isn't entirely even clear what the final business objective is for the technical implementation that the organization is pursuing. And at the end of the day, by far the cheapest risk management technique is avoidance. So if there's no business justification for doing something, for messing with a new tool, then don't do it.
Yeah, I love that advice. Marco, my co-founder, wishes I'd follow that advice myself. It's fun to build things. I get creative. I build some things. Marco goes, "Why'd you do that? It doesn't fit in with what we're doing." I'm like, "Yeah, but it was cool. It was fun." So those projects get abandoned, but some of them do stick. And one of them we tried a while back. We haven't done it haven't revisited it, but we were trying to. I don't know. We have almost 3,000 episodes of podcasts that we've produced. I'd love an agent that analyzes all of that and feeds up a Q&A session with somebody that says, "Have you talked about this topic in relation to this regulation in this industry in this part of the world, and what were some of the highlights of that conversation?" I'd love to do that. We tried, and the first thing I noticed, well, two things scared me. First was the cost to make that possible, and just from tokens and everything you needed to pay for. And then the other is, what if it pumped out something that it was saying the guests were the hosts and they worked for companies they didn't work for? So there was a lot of hallucination. I'm just like, I can't risk the credibility of the response to the prompts that are given. So I shut that project down. But the why was there, but there was a lot more to it than just building something and letting it fly and hoping it works, and didn't even get into the beyond the cost and the integrity of the response to the prompt to say, is there information in there that could be misused in some way or provides access to something that shouldn't be given access to? So anyway, that's my own personal story. Any final thoughts, Walter, after I told that fun one?
No, I appreciate the time, and thank you for having me on the show, Sean.
It's my pleasure. Appreciate you taking the time. And you're very prolific on LinkedIn. I haven't checked the other platforms, but I would encourage everybody to follow you on LinkedIn for sure. You put a lot of good information out there. And this post, I will include the link to, will be in the show notes, so people can check that one and then find you and connect with you and stay in touch. And so thank you again. And everybody listening and watching, thanks for joining me here on Redefining Cybersecurity. Hopefully you learned a few nuggets and can apply them to your own programs and to your own culture. So as Walter pointed out, let's not get in the way. Let's help the organization grow in a way that's safe and secure. That's the whole objective here. So thanks, everybody. Stay tuned for more here on Redefining Cybersecurity, and we'll catch you on the next one.
We hope you enjoyed this episode of the Redefining Cybersecurity podcast with Sean Martin. Please take a moment to rate the show and leave a comment. And remember to share the Redefining Cybersecurity podcast with your friends, family, and colleagues. Come back for more conversations and follow Sean Martin at seanmartin.com as he continues his journey towards redefining cybersecurity.